So we're all learning together and learning in new ways and new environments. The World Heritage Organization was founded 45 years ago, and its mission was to explore the world and to save our human heritage. As you can see here, states that are participants work on preservation and management and conservation of sites that are identified by an international community to save our heritage. There are two different varieties of sites. Some of them are natural and some of them are cultural. And we're going to be focusing primarily on the cultural heritage sites within the state of Israel. And this is their emblem, showing you the interdependence of the world, both naturally and culturally. And it is the symbol that shows the protection of all sites around the world as part of the human experience. The state of Israel is one of the most heavily populated, especially for its size, when it comes to World Heritage sites. And there are 16 of these World Heritage sites scattered around the country. Some of them have been grouped together in clusters, others are entirely standalone. And we're going to be, over the next 4 weeks, looking at all 16 of the World Heritage sites found in Israel. So, as they say, fasten your seatbelts, make sure that your tray tables are in their upright and locked position, and no smoking. And we're going to start out with Akko. By the way, these World Heritage sites range in terms of the human condition from close to 100,000 years ago in prehistoric caves along the slopes of Mount Carmel to the 20th and 21st centuries, such as the White City of Tel Aviv in the middle of the 20th century. So we're going to run the entire gamut, and we're going to start with the old city of Akko. And there you can see it highlighted, number 2 on the map. Now, Akko itself is located along the coastal zone of Israel, a separate, isolated part of the coastal zone that extends from Rosh HaNikra far to the north, which is at the Lebanese border right about here, and Mount Carmel, which plunges directly into the Mediterranean at the city of Haifa. Akko bisects the plain of this coastal zone, which, surprisingly enough, is called the Plain of Akko. It would be designated a World Heritage Site in the first year of the 21st century, 2001. Now, Akko has a number of different names, and as Jack Webb used to say in Dragnet, only the names are changed to protect the innocent. The Greeks referred to the city as Ake, which comes from the Greek word meaning cure. And according to Greek mythology, Heracles would find a number of curative herbs here to heal his wounds. The Jewish historian Josephus, in the 1st century of this era, calls it Acre. And the name was probably changed during the Ptolemies in the 3rd century BCE, primarily by Ptolemy I Soter, the first ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. King Herod would build a city here, and he would name it Antipatris, after his father. It would be here that the Jewish community would meet with a Roman official by the name of Petronius. Petronius would be sent by the Roman emperor in the end of the 1st century BCE to set up statues of the emperor. However, the Jewish community in Akko would meet with Petronius and convince him to turn back. Later on, in the 1st century of this era, St. Paul would spend a day in the newly named city of Ptolemais. And this is found in the book of Acts of the New Testament, chapter 21, verse 7. Much of the Crusader city of Akko is part of Akko underground, a tremendous complex of buildings ranging in date from the Roman era all the way through the Crusader era. It would be built upon by the Ottoman Turks as part of their urban renewal in the 16th and the 17th centuries. As a result, many of these Roman and Crusader buildings would become basements to Ottoman Turkish buildings. This meant that when archaeologists came and rediscovered Akko underground, all they had to do was a bit of light dusting and vacuuming to clear out some of the ancient buildings. And today, many of them have been shored up, have been preserved, have been renovated, and are part of not just the World Heritage Sites, but part of the National Parks Authority archaeological sites that you can then walk through Akko underground, 20 feet below the surface, and see these magnificent structures that are anywhere from 1,300 to 2,000 years in age. The Citadel of Akko, that you can see encircled in the plan on the left-hand side of the screen, was originally an Ottoman Turkish fortification. And it was built on top of the Knights Hospitaller Citadel that dates to the 12th century. And you can see that archaeologists have opened up the massive courtyard of the Hospitaller Citadel in both of the right-hand pictures. The ground level of modern Akko today is right up here, and it looks like a mezzanine if you look at the courtyard of the Crusader Citadel. And you see this row of white buildings right over here, adjacent to the arcade here and the arcade prior to restoration up here. Those are the remaining elements of the infamous Akko prison. And this is where Paul Newman was imprisoned in the movie, okay? No, he wasn't. But this is where many of the Palestinian Jewish freedom fighters of 1947 and 48 who had been arrested by the British during the Mandate would be imprisoned. The Knights Halls, an entire vast complex of buildings, today is another part of this Akko underground. And it was found in the northwest corner of the old city of Akko and has been restored today. Recently renovated in the past decade are the enormous large reception hall, which you can see in the center picture, with its beautiful pointed arches in the lower left picture, and some of the passages that lead to adjacent dining rooms, a dungeon, and residential quarters of the Crusaders. All of this surrounds the remains of an ancient Gothic church. And today, again, this is all 20 feet below ground. Try to disregard the metal bands that you see here. Those were installed by the Department of Antiquities and the National Parks Authority to ensure the central column of the enormous reception hall from splintering, from collapsing, from eroding after the dirt had been removed from around it. Linking the Roman buildings and then reused and modified by the Crusaders were a series of underground passages that linked all of the buildings in the old harbor facility of Akko. This meant that during the Roman and Crusader periods, if the city was being besieged and the enemy was firing ballistas, huge catapult stone balls into the city, people could move from one building to the next underground without being exposed to this kind of heavy artillery. All of the buildings then were also connected by small open passages that allowed for food and water and weapons to be transferred from one building to the next via these underground passages. And here you can see the entrance to the underground passage from the Crusader reception hall on the left, and then it would adjoin with the arched or vaulted Roman passages that the Crusaders rediscovered that you can see on the right. At times, for those of us that are really tall, anywhere over 6 to 6.5 feet, you could actually be forced to bend over in the Roman passages on the right for fear of bumping your head on top of the stone vault. There were also a series of residential quarters and marketplaces that were discovered as part and parcel of the Crusader city. But today, the old city of Akko and its narrow passages and alleyways maintain the same footprint of the Crusader city of the 12th and early 13th centuries. And many of the shops that we find in the narrow streets of Akko today are simply reuses and remodelings of shops and markets that were organized and run by merchants from Pisa and Amalfi in the Italian peninsula. They pretty much ran the show of Akko during the 12th and early 13th centuries. Archaeological evidence indicates that ceramics and storage jars from as far east as central China, dated to the 12th and 13th centuries, have been found in the debris, showing the long reach of the international trading community focusing in on Akko. And why would Akko play such a major role? Because it was the major seaport facility during the period of the Crusades, and thus served as the conduit from Europe to the Holy Land, and then farther east into Asia and Asia Minor. From Akko, we move to dual sites, both in Akko and in Haifa, the Bahai shrines and the evidence of the Bahai religious community of the 19th and early 20th centuries. For those of you who may be slightly familiar, the Bahai faith was a faith that began amidst the persecution in Persia, modern Iran, in the middle of the 19th century. Now, the Bahai are unique, and the Bahai are pretty gutsy people as a spiritual and social community. They believe in the unity of all of the world's religions, and they believe that the messengers, the prophets of the entire world's community all have value, all have messages from the same God, and all have messages that then are modified from one generation, one century to the next, as humankind's relationship with God evolves. Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and Baha'u'llah are all considered to be prophetic personalities in the range of the Baha'i religious movement. And all of these doctrines serve the same basic core of the relationship that we each have with one God. But then this message, consider it to be God 4.0, if you will, is a new message that comes forward to us from each generation. I think that it's kind of like chutzpah for everyone to assume, maybe philosophically, that God only speaks to one generation, and therefore we rely on those messages from previous generations. The Baha'i say that God will continue to speak to humankind. But this means that the Baha'i also consider the fact that they are going to become one in a series of religious communities in a relationship with God when God speaks again somewhere down the road. The shrine of the Bab, the first messenger of the Baha'i faith, and several other holy sites in Haifa were inscribed just a little over a dozen years ago on the World Heritage List. Bahai is the has its international headquarters in Haifa, and there is a Bahai shrine in each and every continent of the world today. It's built along the slopes of Mount Carmel, and from the top of Mount Carmel, called Hadar HaCarmel, the beauty of the Carmel, you can look down to Haifa Harbor, and midway up or down the slope, depending on which way you look, in this instance, we're looking down, you can see the Bahai shrine and temple surrounded by gardens in the distance right here. The most recent of heavenly teachers, as the Baha'i called spiritual leaders and prophets throughout the centuries, was a gentleman by the name of Baha'u'llah, who died in 1892. His arrival was heralded to the world by a fellow by the name of Sayyid Ali Muhammad Shirazi, also known as the Bab. And Bab in Farsi and in Arabic means gate. So this man was seen as the first announcer or mouthpiece, announcing to the world the coming of Baha'u'llah, the glory of God. If you want to draw a parallel with Christianity, you could almost say that the Bab is the same kind of character or personality as John the Baptist in terms of announcing, being the precursor to the ministry of the Rabbi Jesus. Baha'u'llah was exiled by Turkish authorities to the city of Acco, where he would be under house arrest. He would write his doctrines, and he would die a peaceful death in 1892. His remains were hidden for years because the Bab, the first precursor, and his remains were hidden because he died a martyr's death in front of a firing squad. The Persians were not really thrilled with the message that he was bringing in the 1850s. Eventually, his remains would be brought to the Holy Land, and during one of his visits to Haifa, he pointed out to his son that he wanted to be buried along the slopes of Mount Carmel, and then a tomb would be created in his memory and honor along the slopes as part of this massive Baha'i complex. It was a simple 6-room building that was constructed at the beginning of the 20th century. And the older son of Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, would also be buried in this complex. It's in the midst of stunningly beautiful gardens. So this is almost a combination of cultural and natural World Heritage historic sites. The shrine would be enlarged and would be stepped down in a series of terraces along the western slope of Mount Carmel, descending towards Haifa Harbor. It would be designed by William Sutherland Maxwell, the fellow you see on the right, and the overseer of the entire project, the manager, if you will, was Shoghi Effendi, the gentleman that you see on the left. The governing body of the Baha'i faith, called the House of Justice, is located in this neoclassic building designed by Hussein Amanat, the fellow you see here. Also along the slopes of Mount Carmel as part of this complex. As you can see here, it is done in the neoclassical style, utilizing Corinthian architecture. The Bahai Shrine itself, or temple, again reflecting the unity of all faiths throughout the world, is done in a combination of Eastern and Western styles. The dome itself, can you imagine, has 12,000 fish scale tiles. There are 50 different shapes and sizes. They were all imported from Portugal, and they were fire glazed with gold leaf on their surface. The cylinder that rises above this temple complex is about 34 feet in height, and it's on a circular steel reinforced concrete ring that sits on top of the octagon, as you can see here in the lower picture. The shrine is decorated also in mosaics, in green and in scarlet hues. And you can see on each of the corners of the building, there is that same fire gilded style reflecting the great name of the Baha'i faith located in this turquoise disc that's located on each of the four corners of the structure itself. It is a stunningly beautiful building. The shrine is a place for quiet meditation and prayer. There are no ceremonies or services conducted inside of it, but the Baha'i would come here and they would visit the shrine that's known throughout the world as the heart and soul of the Baha'i faith. And it's here that you find something called the Tablet of Visitation. And you have this beautiful passage that reflects the nature of the Baha'i faith and its oneness with the human experience. It's written in both Arabic and then translated into English. The praise which hath dawned from thy most august self, and the glory which hath shone forth from thy most effulgent beauty, rest upon thee, O thou who art the manifestation of grandeur, and the King of eternity, and the Lord of all who are in heaven and on earth. And it goes on and on and on. Further up the slope, just 150 meters or so away from the shrine, is what's referred to as the International Archives Building. And no, we're not in Greece. If it looks like the Parthenon, it is an accurate representation of the footprint of the Parthenon on the Acropolis. There are 58 marble columns and hanging gardens surrounding it. These are administrative buildings. They're not open to tourists, but they are open to anyone of the Baha'i faith to do archival research, especially when it comes to ancestry and heritage. All of the buildings face to the north, towards Acco, which then is the burial place of Baha'u'llah. The gardens are the latest addition and expansion of the Mount Carmel Baha'i slopes. They would be expanded and enlarged and re-inaugurated in 2001. Can you imagine they extend almost a half a mile down the slope of the mountain, and they're over 400 meters wide. There are 18 different terraces, and the drop in elevation is 225 meters. They have 100 gardeners that take care of all of these gardens on a daily basis. I wonder if they're practicing social distancing now. Now, when all of the shrine was completed with the exception of the gardens, the manager, Shoghi Effendi, would say in 1953, "It's the Queen of Carmel enthroned on God's mountain, crowned in glowing gold, robed in shimmering white, girdled in emerald green, enchanting every eye from air, sea, plain, and hill. It's quite a complex, and it's a visual feast for everyone, whether it's during the day or if you see it at night, as you see here. But the Bahai shrines, as part of the World Heritage Site, combine both the location in Haifa that we saw and in Acco as well. This was the last residence and the burial place of the founder, Baha'u'llah, and it's located just outside of the old city, part of the new city. You approach it by a circular, long, winding path that then has passages in this radiating garden that are like the spokes of a wheel. And according to Baha'i tradition, you enter into these gardens and you enter in silence. And as you approach the burial place in the heart of this circular garden, many of the Baha'i believe that the intensity of the silence seems to grow and grow and grow the closer you get to his burial shrine. It's a world of peace and serenity, but it's not enclosed by a wall, it's not isolated, it's open to all. Here you can see the gate and the approach to the shrine. And there are two structures that are found within. You've got the manor and the shrine of Baha'u'llah. The mansion covers 740 square meters, and it was then later purchased for Baha'u'llah and the Holy Family to live in. The shrine is where Baha'u'llah, the prophet, was buried, and it's the most sacred pilgrimage site for all of the Baha'i. It's called the place of happiness. From there, we move further into the 20th century and to the white city of Tel Aviv, located right here at number 6. Now, the coastal zone of Israel is the densest area of population. And the regional population is well over 3.2 million people. And the history of this part of the Sharon Plain of the coast, the area of Tel Aviv and its lesser sister city, Yafo, is a long, rich heritage that's over 3,500 years old. In world rankings, the city ranks 42nd among the world's global cities. It's the financial capital, it's the major capital of performing arts, it's the business center as well, and for those of you familiar, it's also been called the city that never sleeps. It was founded only 110 years or so ago, April the 11th, 1909. The name of Tel Aviv was finally adopted just about a year later, the 21st of May, 1910. The name comes from the book of Ezekiel. It originally was the name of a city in Babylon where the prophet Ezekiel had his vision of the dry bones. And in Ezekiel 3:15, it says, "And I was going towards the exiles of Tel Aviv, towards those that remain near the Kibar River." Tel Aviv, the hill of springtime. And it was a far cry from the city that we have today. But the very first restaurant in Tel Aviv that was open was called Shankman's Eatery in 1909. And you can see it in the upper left. They were innovative for their day because they had valet parking for their camels. Okay. Anyway, the first thing that would have happened in 1909, as some of the earlier pioneers came to the area of Tel Aviv on land that was purchased from the Ottoman Turkish government and some absentee landowners in Ankara and Istanbul, was to allocate the land. And there you can see in the lower left-hand picture, the gathering of some of the first individuals who then would get allocated land along the dunes that made up the coast of Tel Aviv. Now, why was this land so readily sold by the Turkish government and by absentee Turkish landowners? Because it consisted of swampland. They were sand dunes that effectively blocked the drainage of some of the small streams and rills that ran from the interior of the Sharon Plain to the Mediterranean. And if this land did not have good drainage, well, then the greatest population in the area was mosquitoes. And so the land was not considered to be hospitable or habitable by the technology of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and they thought that they were pulling the socks over the eyes of the Jewish settlers coming from Europe. But Western and Central European technology, especially when it came to drainage channels, would allow for the swamplands to be drained and the land become hospitable. There you can see the very first public building, Ahuzat Bayit, in the lower right, and the area of Neve Tzedek, the first community in 1909, which is in the southern area of modern Tel Aviv today, right on the border with Jaffa. After the creation of the State of Israel in 1949, this beautiful monument was constructed on the boulevard that was opposite the original governmental building of the city of Tel Aviv. It lists, and ladies, I apologize, but it lists the 60 founding fathers on one side, and the other shows you a very graceful reflecting pool and a fountain. So that you can see it from both sides in these images. Well, I just mentioned the draining of the swamps, and here you can see the activity of draining the swamps in the upper two pictures. The digging of channels, lining it with tiles and stone, thus allowing for water, surface water and groundwater that would be standing to be drained away and into the Mediterranean, thus reducing the mosquito population and then making it land that was habitable. Allenby Street would be created, that you can see in the lower right-hand picture. Originally, it was a boardwalk type of street over the sand dunes as it led away directly from the coast. And I know that many, if not all of you, have been to Israel once or maybe twice or maybe 53 times in your lifetime. And you know that Israel pretty much has led the way in terms of the Western world in terms of public transportation. Bus systems and terminals, and now there's light rail systems, etc. But the very first coach line, public coach line to be created in 1911 was the Tel Aviv-Jaffa Coachline, and it ran all 7 miles in length from Tel Aviv, old Tel Aviv, down into the seaport of Jaffa, which lay just to the south. The very first Jewish community was called Neve Tzedek. It was built just outside the walls of the seaport of Jaffa, just to the north. And it prospered, and it became the first modern Hebrew-speaking city and community in the area of Palestine. after it was incorporated into Tel Aviv. And the population of Tel Aviv moved slowly further north towards the Yarkon River. The area of Neve Tzedek would begin slowly to decline. And during the middle to later part of the 20th century, Neve Tzedek became a Sephardic Israeli community that was bypassed by the glitz and the glamour of the more modern portions of Tel Aviv and the more modern portions and neighborhoods as they expanded north and to the east. But in the 1980s, Tel Aviv and the Israeli government would carry out a massive rejuvenation project. And that is extraordinarily evident in many of the buildings that have been restored and have been repurposed and reutilized. One of the great modern dance gurus of Israel and the entire world was a woman by the name of Susan Delong. And one of the major apartment buildings that was in disrepair in the early 1980s would be renovated and repurposed to become known as the Susan Delong Center for the Performing Arts. And it's the building that you see in the lower right. And where was it located? I found this picture. This is the area of the Susan Delong Performing Arts Center in the lower left-hand picture in 1910. I guess they only had, he's not socially distancing because that stool is right next to him, I guess. But Neve Tzedek means the abode of justice. And it's also one of the names that's given to God according to the book of Jeremiah. As Tel Aviv began to grow further to the north, we find that the original city plan would be laid out according to Central and Western European plans. In other words, the grid system, north-south, east-west, boulevards, streets, and avenues. Now this works fine. And this is all that these people envisioned because they were Europeans coming to build, design, expand this city. So they had a number of major boulevards that would run east to west, all coming to an end along the Tel Aviv coast and the Tel Aviv beaches. Now, these guys had a great notion. They thought that people wanted to live in great apartment buildings that were running north-south and would have wonderful views of the Mediterranean just to the west. But they also wanted to have easy access. So as you can see in the upper right-hand picture, they built these buildings directly at the dead end of these boulevards. Now, this area of the world is unique climatologically. Just around 10:30 or 11 o'clock in the morning, every morning, a breeze kicks up from the Mediterranean and blows from west to east. This is great because in the days prior to electricity, prior to ventilators, fans, prior to air conditioning, the breezes would help to cool the interior of the city, blowing in from the coast. But when you build massive apartment buildings that come to a dead end of those streets running east-west, it effectively blocks the breezes. That's why Tel Aviv became a hot, humid, sticky, disgusting place around 2 o'clock in the afternoon before air conditioning was created, because these massive buildings blocked the flow of air, from the natural flow of air from west to east. And where did all these come to an end? They came to an end, these east-west streets, on Hayarkon Street that you see on the left. It is the major north-south street of Tel Aviv, right along the Mediterranean coast and the beaches. There you can see it in 1915, and then here you can see it as it exists today. And this is what we're talking about once again when it comes to those massive buildings that would be first constructed and then renovated and remodeled, torn down and rebuilt in the same footprint along the coast, effectively blocking circulation and airflow into the city. Today, if a building is to be torn down of this nature, a building is not built in that same high-rise footprint, because the Tel Avivians have come to recognize the importance of airflow and the natural breezes. Some of the pictures that you're going to see over the next couple of minutes are pictures that my father took during World War II. He was stationed in North Africa with the US Army, and when they went R&R, he would go to Cairo, he would go to Tel Aviv, he would go to Jerusalem. So I've got some of the pictures. And here you can see pictures of the Tel Aviv beach and the Corniche, the waterfront in 1944, and the way that it looks today. Here's Allenby Street in 1944 and the way that it looks today. During the 1930s, the modernist movement of art and architecture was reaching its peak in Europe. And the city of Tel Aviv would be in an intensive development and would then reflect styles and trends coming out of Europe in the early 1930s. Now, for many people who would visit Tel Aviv up until the late 1990s, they would call it a drab, gray city of concrete. And part of the reason was because concrete was the most abundant building material that you have. In Israel, there were very few forests, little use of wood, mainly because of the Crusaders in the 12th and the 13th centuries. The Crusaders only knew how to build coming out of Europe where the trees were in abundance, so the Crusaders pretty much deforested the area 700-800 years ago. Today, obviously, through Karen Kayemet Israel, you've got the repopulation and reforestation of Israel, especially over the last half a century. But the building material out of necessity and out of choice was concrete. However, the Israelis have become masters at using concrete in terms of shape and form and style. But in the 1930s, concrete block was pretty much drab and pretty much gray at that time. However, the heart and soul of Tel Aviv that would be designed in the 1930s would be called the White City, designed by the Scotsman, Sir Patrick Geddes, in 1925, and the buildings would all take on their nature and shape over the period of 2 decades. And what's interesting is that this new architectural style called Bauhaus would come out of Nazi Germany of the late 1920s and early 1930s. And it's kind of an irony that the greatest collection of Bauhaus buildings still existing today and restored as part of the Tel Aviv White City World Heritage Community, numbering 1,500, can be found in Tel Aviv, not in Europe at all. And many people believe that the Bauhaus movement is actually a local style in Tel Aviv because of its great abundance. It was made a World Heritage Site in 2002, just 18 years ago. And it is reflective of what Geddes called is European Garden City. It shuns ornamentation and favors functionality. It uses asymmetry and irregularity versus symmetry, and it grasps architecture in terms of space versus mass. The buildings are usually cubic with right angles, but they are softened at times with rounded balconies, as you can see in the upper picture. Number 17 Emile Zola Street and number 21 below Melchet Street. There are 3 World Heritage Zones in the heart of Tel Aviv, as you can see outlined in the map to the right. It was concerned with the social aspects of design and a new form of social housing for the workers, many of whom socialists, not communists, coming out of the communal style from Eastern, Central Europe, and the former Tsarist Russia, and now Soviet Russia in the 1930s. It's because of new engineering developments that this whole style comes about. If you watch HGTV, this was the beginning of it, because buildings now were built as envelopes, not with necessarily internal support walls and structural walls, but the envelopes using steel I-beam construction that allowed for the open floor plan that everybody's in love with on channel 665 if you got Frontier. The walls no longer supported the structure, but enveloped it, as I said just now. Again, over 1,500 Bauhaus-style international structures are found in Tel Aviv, both residential and commercial. Some of them have been stunningly restored and repurposed. For example, one of them has not been repurposed, but continues in use for over 70 years. The Haaretz print house for the newspaper. And here is the way it looks today. And they adapt some of the key elements as well, according to the climactic conditions in Tel Aviv. In Europe, you've got big windows because you want to let in as much light as possible, given the fact that it's in a northern climate and it's dark much earlier in the day. But in Tel Aviv, with the warmth closer to the equator, the modification was high windows that were narrow in terms of their vertical height and were underneath overhangs or eaves that allowed them to be shaded to keep the hot sun from entering into buildings. Here you can see some of the balconies, which today, because space is at a premium in Tel Aviv as the population continues to grow, many of those balconies have been enclosed, like people who have condos today and enclose their lanais. They also built these buildings because they understood the nature of the climate, and the first floors were oftentimes simply parking areas, because this allowed for an envelope of air to circulate around the building, and this allowed it to be cooled from every single side. Another element were the flat roofs. You didn't worry about pitched roofs for this architectural style in Tel Aviv. And so the rooftop became the the residential collective gathering social point for the population. Everybody would go up on the roof and have a beer and socialize or hang out their laundry. And here you can see then one of the houses today called the Thermometer House, because of the windows that you've got there, located on Rehov Frug, and you have got the Cinema Hotel on Sderot Zamenhof, which originally was a theater, a cinema, and has been converted in the past 2 decades into a hotel. So these are just some of the World Heritage Sites that we're going to be taking a look at over the next now 3 more weeks. But as Jeremy indicated, okay, and see, Jeremy, we negotiated 53 minutes. We've got some time for some questions that you might have based on these 3 starters. So it's your show now, Jeremy.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Derfler. If anybody has a question, please use the chat icon at the bottom of your screen.
I'll
And
see it and answer it.
If there are no questions today, which you were so comprehensive.
Or incomprehensible, one of the 2.
Either one works, but okay, it looks like we're done with this first segment, and I appreciate you all joining us here.
Thank you.
It's been really great to scroll through and see people's faces. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you all, and we'll see you next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Stay safe.
10:30.
10:30. Thank you.
That's 9:30 Central Time.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
And these are some of the ones that we're going to be seeing next. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right.